Today's case is going to be on Dorothy Jane Scott. Dorothy was 32 at the time of her abduction and was a single mom to her 4-year-old son. She was described by family and friends as a loving and giving person. She loved her family, God, and her friends. Dorothy and her son lived with her aunt in Staten, California, a 20-minute drive from her parents' home and where she worked. Dorothy was a secretary for Swinger Psych Shop and Custom John's Head Shop. Sometime in early 1980, Dorothy began receiving weird phone calls while at work. Dorothy's stalker would tell her details from her daily routine, what she'd been doing, who she'd spoken with, or she'd been with her son. At times, her stalker would profess his love for her, and other calls, he was angry. Once he left a dead rose on her windshield of her car. Once he left a dead rose on the windshield of her car while she was at work. Dorothy told her mother, Vera Scott, that she recognized the man's voice but couldn't remember who it was. Then Dorothy received a call that really freaked her out. Her stalker said, "Okay, now you're going to come my way, and when I get you alone, I will cut you up into bits so no one will ever find you." Dorothy wanted to get a gun, but had decided to just take a karate class for self-defense. On May 27th, 1980, Dorothy dropped her son off at her parents' home and went to a work meeting. During the meeting, she noticed one of her coworkers, whose name was Conrad, looked sick, and her and another coworker named Pam decided to take him to the hospital. He was suffering from a spider bite. But before going to the hospital, Dorothy stopped at her parents' house to let them know what she was doing. Dorothy and her coworker Pam waited for Conrad to finish up. He then was released at 11 p.m. Pam and Conrad headed to the hospital pharmacy to fill out his prescription. Dorothy headed to the parking lot to get her car because she didn't want Conrad walking that far, but Dorothy never returned. Conrad and Pam headed to the hospital's entrance with his prescription, where they thought they'd find Dorothy waiting with the car, but there was no sign of her. They decided to walk over to where the car was originally parked. As they made their way there, they saw Dorothy's car racing towards them, its high beam blinding them from seeing who might be driving. The white Toyota station wagon didn't stop or slow down, but instead entered the road and drove off. Pam and Conrad waited a couple of hours for Dorothy, thinking maybe she had some emergency concerning her son. They contacted the hospital security and they agreed that there was no reason for concern. During their time at the hospital, Pam and Dorothy were in each other's company, except for Dorothy using the restroom right before heading to the parking lot. When Dorothy didn't return, Conrad and Pam called her parents. They also had no word from their daughter, and Dorothy was reported missing. At 5 a.m. the following morning, Dorothy's car was found burning in an alley about 10 miles from the hospital. About a week after Dorothy's abduction, her mother, Vera, began receiving calls from her daughter's stalker, saying, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" The stalker asked. "Yes," replied Vera Scott. "I have her," the stalker said, and hung up. Dorothy's family informed the police of her stalker and the phone calls and threats they had received. After a couple of weeks of fruitless searching, Vera and Jacob Scott took Dorothy's story to the local paper and offered a $25,000 reward for any leads regarding their daughter's case. On June 12th, 1980, Pat Riley, an editorial manager for the Santa Ana Register, received a call from a man claiming to have killed Dorothy. The caller said, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." For the next 3 years, Dorothy's stalker would call Dorothy's parents occasionally. The police tapped the phone, hoping for the location of Dorothy's abductor, but he never stayed on the line long enough. Dorothy's stalker now seemed to be stalking her parents. He only ever called when Vera was home alone. Then one day, Sean Scott, Dorothy's son, came home early and answered the phone, and suddenly the call stopped until the news that Dorothy's remains had been found, and the call started again. "Is Dorothy home?" he'd asked before hanging up. The Scotts never changed their phone number, hoping that Dorothy's abductor would allow them to speak with their daughter. Dorothy's ex, the father to her son, was eliminated early on as a suspect because he was in Missouri at the time of her abduction. In 1994, on Dorothy's birthday, her father, Jacob Scott, passed away. Vera Scott passed away in 2002, 22 years after her daughter's abduction. They never discovered what happened to Dorothy or who was responsible. The case remains unresolved.